Okay, so last week essentially we were looking at two concepts that the Rambam defines. One is the definition of Tshuva Gemura, and the other is the basic definition of Tshuva, bare bones Tshuva. Tshuva Gemura is the situation where you're put in the exact circumstance which caused you to sin the first time, and you have the same abilities. You're young with the same strength, the same taivas, the same yetzer hara, and you're faced with the identical circumstance, and you're not nichshal. So that is the sign from heaven that your tshuva is absolutely complete. And the point that we wanted to make last week was simply the point that you're not allowed to test yourself in that way, and therefore Tshuva Gemura is only a, so to speak, a gift that God puts you in, that you recognize that Baruch Hashem, your Tshuva is complete. But then the second definition the Rambam gave us is the definition of regular Tshuva, basic Tshuva, and even that is very, very extreme. That is the test that God can testify that you will never do the sin again. So even if you don't have the same koach, so to speak, but if Hashem can say you'll never do the sin again, that is tshuva. And we talked about Hilchos, that according to the Kesef Mishnah, the words Yo'id alav yodea talumos, which some people translate, which is what the first translation, that God who knows my secrets, God can testify, meaning if Hashem knows you're going to do the Aveira again, you have no tshuva, which is almost impossible, versus the Kesef Mishnah's interpretation that you are calling God as your witness that right now you have kavanah never to do the sin again. In other words, you may be nichshal in the future, but God is calling you, you're calling God as a witness that right now you're in a matzav where you will never do the Aveira again. And then I had mentioned Rabbeinu Yaina, who bichlal is cholek on the Rambam, and Rabbeinu Yonah says that tshuva is a question of derech. What derech have you chosen? And as long as your commitment is that you're going to try not to do the sin again, you want to improve yourself, then even if you'll be nichshal many, many times, you're still on the derech, right? So those were the two concepts of tshuva versus tshuva gemura. Then the Rambam mentions for the first time, this is Perek Beis of Hilchos Tshuva, he mentions the special role of Haser Shemei Tshuva. Again, it's very notable. We're so reflexively assume that Tshuva is about Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, so as soon as we read about Tshuva, we think Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. It's important to note that the Rambam does not even mention Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur till the middle of the second chapter, meaning the mitzvah of Tshuva is totally independent of Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. It is a daily mitzvah. But he then talks about the special role of Haser Shemei Tshuva, which start from Rosh Hashanah through Yom Kippur. Haser Shemei Tshuva, remember I think I mentioned the speculation of Rav Chaim Soloveitchik, that the reason why Hilchos Tshuva are 10 chapters is the Rambam's intention was that you would learn one perek from Rosh Hashanah through Yom Kippur. Haser Shemei Tshuva, 10 prakim, and Haser Shemei Tshuva, Chazal have a drasha. It says in the Navi Yeshayahu, and this is the Haftarah for every fast day, Dirshu Hashem bihi matzo. Dirshu Hashem, seek out Hashem bihi matzo, where he is easily found. Meaning when God is very accessible, seek him out. Kira'uhu biyoso karov. Call out to him when he is close to you. This is a pasuk. So the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah has a drasha. Dirshu Hashem bihi matzo. When is Hashem accessible? These are the 10 days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. These are the great, great days of Haser Shemei Tshuva. Now the truth is, in later Svarim, the whole month of Elul is said to be a Zman of great closeness to Hashem. The Gemara, as far as I know, the Gemara itself does not explicitly make that point about Elul. That's a later point that is made. But the Gemara does explicitly make the point about the Aseres Yemei Tshuva, that this is Dirshu Hashem Bihi Matzo. Okay, and again, I'm just summarizing some things. After that, the Rambam then talks about the well-known halacha that Yom Kippur and Tshuva are only mechaper for the sins bein adam lamakom, but for the sins bein adam lechavero, you must ask forgiveness of the person that you hurt. And here I had mentioned, I'm chazering a little bit, I had mentioned a very interesting machlokas between the Chafetz Chaim and Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, right? You may remember, and that is, are you mechuyav to ask mechila of a person when asking the mechila is going to cause more pain to that person than not asking the mechila? The classic example is Lashon Hara. Let's assume that I said something very nasty about you. I was over on Lashon Hara. And the Chafetz Chaim treats Lashon Hara as a sin of Bein Adam Lechavero. So the Chafetz Chaim writes in the Sefer Chafetz Chaim, I am mechuyev to ask your mechila for saying Lashon Hara about you. And even if you were not aware that I said Lashon Hara about you, the Chafetz Chaim says I must ask mechila. So it is said that Rav Yisrael Salanter was cholek. He was much older than the Chafetz Chaim. He was cholek on this halacha of the Chafetz Chaim because he says, this doesn't make a lot of sense. I go over to you and I say, please forgive me for whatever I did to you this past year. Now you have the right to ask me, what did I do? And I'm mechuyev to say, well, I said Lashon Hara about you. And you have the right to ask me, well, what did you say? So what's my response? You don't want to know? You'd rather not know? Bein kach ubein kach. If my answer is you don't want to know, then you're going to be full of anxiety. What on earth did I say? And if I tell you, that'll even be worse. Or maybe not worse, but pretty bad. So Rabbi Yisrael Salanter basically says, do not ask mechila for averos that will make the person feel worse about themselves than would have been the case had you not asked mechila. In such a situation, halachically, you are an onus, meaning there's a reason why you can't do this, because I'm an onus. I'm unable to do it because that would be causing more pain. So b'chi aydavna, HaKadosh Baruch Hu will exempt you from the obligation of bakashas mechila. So this is a big, big machlokas. The Chafetz Chaim says, you are mechuyav to ask mechila. Rabbi Yisrael Salanter says, in many of these cases, it is forbidden to ask mechila. And who's the halacha like? So again, obviously I can't be makriya, but it is said in the name of Rav Aaron Kotler that on all inyanim of musar and midos, the halacha is like Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, even over the Chafetz Chaim. So this is an important Torah. Now you understand that in the particular context of Lashon Hara, it very much depends. Meaning, if you know that I said this nasty thing against you, so you know it already, so then I'm mechuyev to ask mechila. You know. By the way, Lashon Hara, as you know, the issur of Lashon Hara is even if it's true, even if it's a true statement. And in many, many ways, doing tshuva for true negative statements is actually more difficult than false. Because if I said something true about somebody that's really derogatory, I mean, I can't really take it back because it's true. If it's false, even if it's false, it's very hard to take back, but at least I could say it was a lie. But if it's true, what do I say? So the interesting question is, am I allowed to say it was a lie even if it was true? Meaning there are some poskim that say, B'chi aydavna, I am allowed, if I wrongfully embarrassed somebody by derogatory true information, I am permitted to try to fix it by making myself a liar, by saying it's not true. So that's a machlokas. On one hand, it's usher to lie. On the other hand, it might be mutter to lie in order to take away the embarrassment of the person. But but bichlal, whether it's true or false, it's very, very difficult to make amends for lashon hara. The famous story with the Chafetz Chaim, where somebody went to him and they say, "How do I do tshuva for lashon hara?" I mean, things spread. How do I take it back? Because remember, part of tshuva is not only your own tshuva and your own asking of forgiveness, but to try to undo the damage. You try to undo the damage. So how do you undo the damage? So the Chafetz Chaim says, I have a perfect solution. Go get yourself a pillow that is stuffed with goose feathers. That's how they used to stuff the pillows. And go on top of the roof. So the man is excited. He thinks this is a segula. This is like, some magical thing. Go on. Take the pillow. Go on a roof. Shake the pillowcase. Shake it, shake it, shake it. And all the pillows fly, all the feathers fly all over the place. And the man says, yes, yes, yes. And then what happens? He says, final step. Go gather all the feathers and put them back into the pillow. And that's how you do tshuva for lashon hara. Very, very, very difficult. Now you know that this was talking about a much more smaller society. You gossiped in Radin, so 100 families heard something negative. Now you have internet, you have social media. Things can be spread to millions and millions and millions of people. I mean, not that millions of people are going to read every stupid post, but theoretically things can happen. There have been suicides based on people being outed as gay or whatever it is. People kill themselves. I mean, now that a million people know something about me that I wouldn't want them to know. Embarrassing, humiliating information. So when Chazal say that lashon hara can be a form of murder, number one, in a figurative sense, that's vaday so, because it says if you embarrass somebody publicly, it's as if you murdered them. So that level of murder for sure. But number two, in the most literal sense of murder, people have committed suicides. And if people commit suicide because I posted some embarrassing information about them, then so halachically, a Beis Din could not sentence me for murder. That's emes. That's called a grama. But spiritually, in Shemayim, the Baal Lashon Hara is a Rotzeach. Is vadi considered to be a murderer in God's heavenly law because he put into action the circumstances that, God forbid, caused a person to take their life. Yeah.
Let's say somebody wronged somebody else, like A wronged B, and it was a long time ago, and B is aware, like they spoke in front of Hara and B knows about it. Alpi Rav Yisrael Salanter, if A is concerned that by asking for mechila, it would remind B of what happened, and therefore B could make the pain that A originally caused him, would A ask for mechila from B?
In other words, in a case where the victim knew about it but had forgotten.
Forgotten, or we'll just be reminded.
That's a good question. I think the svara of Rav Yisrael would still apply, but it's a little more questionable because Rav Yisrael is talking about where the person never knew. By the way, Rav Yisrael Salanter's philosophy is consistent, or this ruling is consistent with his overall philosophy. He said the famous saying that it's forbidden to be a tzaddik on somebody else's cheshbon. Meaning you want to be a tzaddik by doing your mitzvahs in a perfect way, but if you're going to do so by hurting somebody, don't be a tzaddik on somebody else's cheshbon. For example, all sorts of famous stories. What's the Maisa? Well, many stories. He was left, once he was sick before Pesach, and he left instructions about how to make matzah shmura, special rules. And his Talmidim asked him, what are your special instructions? And he said, the first instruction is, don't make the almana overwork, because widows were the ones who would need the dough, and be concerned about the almana, don't be so machmir to impose a lot of hardship. And they tell the story that Rav Yisrael Salanter who was from Vilna. Salant was a suburb of Vilna, so he was from Vilna, he's from Lithuania. But a lot of his adult life, he separated from his family. He traveled in France and Germany. He did Kiruv Rechokim before there was an Ohr Somayach and Eish Torah. He would go to isolated cities where most of the Jews were either Reform or totally secular, and he would try to spread Torah and Musar in various ways. He would only come back to Vilna like Pesach and Sukkot, like twice a year he would come back, but for a lot of the time he was traveling all over the place. And one time in Germany, one of his Talmidim, who happened to be from, invited him for Shabbos, and he said to Rabbi Sol Salanter, he says, Rebbe, Baruch Hashem, we have a beautiful, beautiful Shabbos table. We have the Suda lasts like 4 hours long, and I know we have food. I know that's not the Rebbe's issue, but we have Divrei Torah. We have an hour of Divrei Torah between each course, and we have Zemiros and Islavos and Ruchnius and Kedusha. He says this would be a wonderful, wonderful thing. And with the Rebbe there, how much more so? So Rabbi Sol Salanter said, my one condition is that from Kiddush to the end of benching be under a half an hour. He says, I don't want 3 hours or 4 hours. I want there to be Kiddush, eat, bench, half an hour or less. So the person was very disappointed to have Rabbi Yisrael over to his house. He thought he would have a real inspirational meal, so real quick. So it's 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. All right, the Talmud did what the Rebbe wanted. So then Rabbi Sol Salanter said, could I talk to the cook, the woman that did all the cooking and preparation? So the woman comes out. She was also a widow, and this was her parnasa. She was a cook in people's homes. And he apologized to the widow. He says, I know that you normally have much more time to put out the meal. I apologize if I rushed you. So the woman says, Rebbe, you have given me the greatest Shabbos of my life. Every Friday night I come here, and I'm here for 4 or 5 hours besides the Friday afternoon. And then I come home to have my own Suda with my 12-year-old son. And it's already 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock. And he waited for me. And we don't even have time to spend time together. Baruch Hashem, you liberated me to be able to come home and have a real meal with my child and spend time with him. He says, Hashem should give you a lot of brachas. So Rabbi Sol Salanter looked at the Talmud and said, don't be a tzaddik on the almanas cheshbon. Your beautiful, nice, long, inspirational meal means that she has spent, and Rabbi Sol Salanter figured this out, means she doesn't spend time with her child. Do you think you're doing a mitzvah by that? Right, so this was his shita, bichlal. Nitila shadayim. The Gemara in Chulin says, when you pour water for Nitila shadayim, you should use more water than you need. That somehow, we don't understand why, extra water for Nitila shadayim is a segula for parnasa and ashiras. By the way, I just want to point out, the washing cups we use is already much, much, much more water. You need for Nitila shadayim a revius of water, 4 ounces. A washing cup typically has around 12 ounces. So you already have 3 times more. A regular washing cup is much, much more. Rabbi Sol Salanter used to, when he did Nitila shadayim, he would be mitzamtim. He would literally pour the minimum amount of water. And someone said, oh, the Gemara says you're supposed to pour a lot of water. He says, well, listen, the Gemara is talking about, remember, they didn't have indoor plumbing in those days. So there were water drawers. There were people who would go to wells, and they would schlep buckets of water. So he said, hey, when the Gemara says use a lot of water, that's talking about when you bring the buckets. If you're going to make your servants or your help bring extra buckets for Nitila shadayim, he says, that's not such a great mitzvah in which you're causing people that tircha. So consistent with the idea, in fact, another, there's so many examples of this. Another example is that during Elul, especially in Lithuania, among the Misnagdim, people were so serious face, and we saw, so they wouldn't talk, they wouldn't smile. So Yisrael Salanter says, just because this guy wants to do tshuva, he has to ruin my day. He says, once again, what is that? So this was one of his main teachings, and this is very consistent with his approach on Mechila as well. It's mamish the same idea, that yes, of course you have to ask Mechila, but if your Mechila is going to cause him tsar, so what? You want to be a tzaddik? So in such a situation, Rabbi Yisrael maintained that the Torah patters you from bakashas Mechila, and you do tshuva, you have charata, regret, and kabbalah al asid, and you pray that HaKadosh Baruch Hu should be mochel you. On the other hand, the Chafetz Chaim apparently took this in a much more literal way. The Chafetz Chaim said, "I did something wrong to you. I have to go back and ask Mechila." So it is a machlokas, but I think the halacha generally is, as Rav Aaron Kotler said, like Rabbi Yisrael Slatcher. Yeah.
Would you hold that you have to remember it, and then if the guy dies, you should go to his grave?
So that's an interesting question, because that's another halacha that the Rambam brings, and it's interesting how to integrate that. And that is, let's say you sinned against somebody, and the person dies. The person's not alive anymore. So there is a procedure where you actually go to his kever with 9 other people, a minyan, and you ask mechila to the person after his death. Now, that is actually one of the reasons why, commonly at a levaya, you always hear, we ask forgiveness. Part of it is since everybody's there, so it's a way of everybody kind of getting mechila from the person. So your question is a very good question. How would this dovetail with Rav Yosef point? Rav Yosef's point is, I don't ask mechila from the person because I would be causing him pain. Now that may only be a svara if the person's alive. Yeah? Once the person's dead and I'm asking mechila from the mace, so one might say perhaps you're not causing that pain. Either they know it already or whatever. So in such a situation, would you, like Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, would you still have to ask mechila? It is a good question. I don't know. But I think it's mistavra that the chiyuvam of being mavakesh mechila from a mace are not going to be more chomor. They're kind of derivative of what you had to do when the guy was alive. So if you were putter when he was alive, it's not going to resuscitate after death. By the way, I want to make an important chiluk here, that the Rambam, it's not beferish in the Rambam, but the Achrayim say it. The Rambam is talking about, I did something bad to a person when he was alive, and then he died. So there's a chiyuv of bakashas mechila. What if you said something bad about a dead person? Interestingly enough, right? So many Mefarshim say that technically, once a person is dead, you can't do an Aveira against him. In fact, the Chafetz Chaim even brings that there is no Isser of Lashon Hara against the dead. Although it's brought down, there is a Cherem from the Rishonim, an excommunication, not to speak ill of the dead. But technically, it is not Lashon Hara, which would mean, in other words, there is no chiyuv to be mavakesh mechila to what you did to a mace. The Rambam's din is only talking about what you did to a chai who then died. There is a chiyuv of bakashas mechila. Now, the interesting question is, how important is it that you actually show up at the grave? I mean, is that because that's a form of communication, like you're asking mechila? Again, the Rambam doesn't give you an alternative, interestingly enough. He doesn't say, if the trip is too long, he doesn't say, if I read the Rambam literally, it says, you don't get forgiveness until you go to the kever and you're mavakesh. I think I had mentioned, according to some accounts, the Chidah, this was Rabbeinu Yaina. Rabbeinu Yaina was mavazer the Rambam he held, and he wanted to be mavakesh mechila at the Rambam's kever. Although the it's a little shver, because I believe he did it after the Rambam died. I mean, this actually contradicts what I just said. But Rabbeinu Yaina held he wanted to be mavakesh mechila at the kever of the Rambam, and which is Tveria. And Rabbeinu Yaina left Spain to go to Tveria to be mavakesh mechila at the kever of the Rambam, and Rabbeinu Yaina died on the way, so he didn't make it, but he was going to travel to the kever itself. On the other hand, since the neshama of a mace is not necessarily limited to a place, actually, so there is a good svara that if it's difficult for you to travel, you could be mevakesh mechila anywhere. Although again, the Rambam does not beferish give you that chiluk. Yeah.
If you cause tremendous pain to someone, which causes them to take their life, right? If someone takes their life because they have, a lot of pain that can cause them, is there an exception made for that person where he can still have olam haba, where it's like a lesser consequence for him because of the tremendous pain?
You're talking about olam haba for the person who caused the death?
No, who took his life.
About suicide. Yeah. So that's an interesting question. Let me talk just a minute or so about this issue. Ma'amei datzmo ladas, a person commits suicide, right? So suicide is a very big avera. It is recorded in some sources, although we don't know what the makar is actually. There is a statement that's often repeated that one who intentionally commits suicide does not have a share in olam haba. That's a common statement that is quoted. Interestingly enough, it is not clear where the makar is. I cannot direct you to the Gemara or a Maimer Chazal to that effect. So that means it may not be true even, right? It's labdafka, because after all, think about this. Is suicide worse than murder? Because listen, what is the sin of suicide? The sin of suicide is murder. So the same way Reuven cannot kill Shimon, Reuven cannot kill himself. Now, murder is an awful avera. Of course it is. And the person will get punished for it. But it does not cause a forfeiture of olam haba for the good things a person did. So l'chaira, it's logically questionable. Why do you tell me a suicide does not have a chelik in olam haba? A suicide is a murderer, okay? Murderers have a chelik in olam haba. Unless you're going to say, what? Suicide is worse. In other words, suicide is worse than murder? Well, why would suicide be worse than murder? It's not so pasha. I understand that it's murder. Now, but be it as it may, even if we accept the often quoted statement that a suicide does not have a share in olam haba, it says in Sefer Hasidim, and this is brought down lahalacha, that this only applies to a cold, premeditated suicide that was not precipitated by emotional pain and extreme distress, which basically 99.9, I would say almost 100% is precipitated, meaning a typical suicide, and certainly the case you're describing, where a person was bullied and a person was intimidated, a person was humiliated, and they took their life. In such a situation, there will be olam haba. In fact, not only that, the Ein Lo Olam Haba is controversial if it's true, but there are some things that are true. It says you don't sit shiva for a suicide, you don't bury him within a regular Jewish cemetery, you bury him in a separate place. That is brought down in the Shulchan Aruch, and there we also apply the rule that if it was precipitated by severe emotional stress or physical pain, we don't apply those rules, and we sit shiva. Unfortunately, I had, when I was a Rav in America, I had, not members of my show committed suicide per se, but family members of them. There were a number of suicides, and in every single case, I had always instructed the family to sit shiva and do regular Jewish burials because these were under severe emotional distress. Again, going back to bullying, again, I'm not aware of this in the Jewish community, Baruch Hashem, but in the general community, a lot of teenagers commit suicide, or even younger than teenagers, sometimes preteens, commit suicide because of incessant bullying. It's amazing. You would think, you think bullying is a harmless little thing. People have taken their lives. Children have taken their lives because of bullying. So for sure, they will not lose their olam haba because of those suicides. Yeah.
Could you make the argument that like the cold premeditated suicide that you were referencing earlier is worse than murder? Because murder, at least, there can be a reason to do it, whereas the cold meditated, that's like denying the judgment of God, that there's an olam haba, that there's a heshbon or whatever.
Yeah. In fact, another way of looking at it, which is kind of the same thing you're saying, is, well, if you're telling me that suicide out of pain is not excusable, but at least it's yesh lo chel olam haba, then murder also normally comes out of the pain or the anger or the like. It's not cold premeditated. So, but maybe it depends. Some murders might, some murders might be. You know, the degree of human pathology is sometimes staggering. I mean, there are people who kill. I mean, they're crazy. Is that a limit? They just want to see what it's like to see somebody die. I mean, you know, they don't even have any anger against this. I want to see what it's like when the light goes out of their eyes. What do you make of that? But there is such evil in the world. Yeah.
Is there an atonement in this world for, let's say, a bully who did cause someone to commit suicide? Like, is that on their cheshbon?
Well, it is on their cheshbon, and is there an atonement? It would be a very, 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 very difficult atonement. I mean, I can't prescribe it exactly. Obviously, they have to live their whole life with that sense of regret, that sense of remorse. But at the same time, they can't use even that as an excuse not to try to grow in Avodas Hashem. There's a story about the Vilna Gaon. You know, the Vilna Gaon, when he was younger, actually went into Golus. He would wander from place to place. As the Rambam writes, Golus is a kapara for sin. So he would go into exile. And in those days, this is the late 1700s, the late 18th century, you had to have papers just to go from city to city. I mean, you had to have passports and all sorts of documents. And the Vilna Gaon didn't have all of the requisite. He had better things to do than stand in some Russian equivalent of Misrat HaPanim for 10 hours. So he sometimes would get arrested and thrown into prison. Right? The Vilna Gaon was thrown into prison a few times. In fact, they say once it was during Sukkot. This was quite amazing. The Vilna Gaon would not sleep, properly so, essentially, outside of the sukkah. But now he's in prison. What does he do? I mean, he's in prison for the whole week. So it says he didn't sleep for a week. He says he would, I mean, just imagine, he would keep his eyes open with his fingers. He would run around, run all the whole night, that he wouldn't fall asleep outside of the sukkah. But in one of his imprisonments, he's sharing a cell with a big burly Jewish guy, Jewish prisoner. And this Jewish prisoner, which is very rare for Jews do white-collar crime, but this Jewish prisoner was there for murder. He was a Rotzeh, he was a big, burly guy, and he killed some people in a brawl. So when they brought them water to drink water, the Vilna Gaon used some of the water for Netilas Yadayim, and the other guy just started eating the bread without Netilas Yadayim. So the Vilna Gaon says to him, you have to wash your hands before you eat bread. So the man started laughing. The man started saying, look at these hands. A big guy says, these hands have broken people's neck. These hands have murdered people. You think Hashem cares if I pour water on these hands that are filled with blood? The man was not saying it out of tshuva. The man was saying it out of mocking, in a mocking tone. And the Vilna Gaon says, what does murder have to do with Netilas Yadayim? He says, yeah, murder is a real bad aveira. But just because we don't say kamle b'drabim, right? Kamle b'drabim, right, is a rule about punishment, that if I do an aveira for which I get the death penalty, and incidentally I do lesser damage, I don't have to pay for the lesser, because the bigger punishment covers the lesser. That's not true by aveiros. Don't think because you've done the big aveiros, the little aveiros don't count. And the Vilna Gaon told the guy, listen, even a Reitzayach has to wash his hands. Now, this, on one hand, it's muster, but on the other hand, it's a very encouraging message, because what it's telling a person is, no matter how big aveiros you're doing, and even still doing, that doesn't mean your small mitzvahs don't count. And that's why we tell a person, whatever mitzvah you're able to do, continue to do. because there is no idea that your mitzvah is worthless because your averos are so great. So, in answer to your question, the person still has to try to do what he can. But it's an awful burden to bear. It truly is an awful burden to bear. And B'ezras Hashem, at some point Hashem will forgive him, but it may be a very, very long process. It may not be until after Misa, after Gehenna, after all of those difficult issues. The Neder Yehuda has a tshuva about this. Neder Yehuda actually has a tshuva, an interesting tshuva. Rav Yecheskel Lando, the Rav of Prague, 1700s, one of the great poskim, about a person, I don't remember the whole detail, but it was basically about, he was supposed to give a bottle of water to somebody, and instead it was a bottle of poison. It looked the same, or acid. And the person drank it, and the person died. So it was unintentional. It was not intentional murder, it was unintentional. The question was, what type of tshuva does a person have? And Neder Yehuda talks about the Torah and Staka and Shaviras Halev and Golos. Now, in the Kabbalists, in the literature of Kabbalah, there is a whole genre called sigufim. Sigufim means physical penances, meaning physically suffering, like sleeping on. In Christianity, this became a big thing, but it also was in Judaism too. Wearing hair shirts, lying on a bed of nails, lying in snow, going to sleep in the snow. In other words, physically afflicting yourself to kind of purify. These are called sigufim. Now, the Rambam does not mention it, and the Baal HaTanya, who wrote a famous Igeres HaTshuva, a letter of Tshuva, also is against sigufim. And the Neder Yehuda himself says he is not going to go in the direction of sigufim because he only bases his hadracha on what is in the Gemara and the poskim. He will not add Kabbalistic sigufim. But in certain parts of Kabbalah, sigufim was a big thing. And some people who were guilty of Ritzicha, they sometimes engaged in these sigufim. Okay.
Thank you for listening to this Ohr Somayach production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.